Shalom. This week we will be concluding Sefer BaMidbar, Book of Numbers, with the double portions of Matot and Masei. Next we'll be starting the Book of Devarim, the exhortation, the final words of Moshe Rabbeinu to his beloved children of Israel. The last 5 weeks of his life is what we'll be reading in the Book of Deuteronomy. Now, the first of our two portions, Parshat Matot, begins with laws pertaining to vows and oaths. And all of these laws are very complicated and they're elucidated in the oral tradition. And from these verses here in the beginning of Parshat Matot, there are many, many details and many situations that our sages discuss the exact laws pertaining to vows. Make a long story short, neder is a vow which really has the power, person has the power to make something holy, to declare a status on something. And a shavua, an oath, is a question of an individual taking something upon himself, requiring one to perform an act. And both of these instances, the concept of the oath, the concept of the vow, show us the tremendous power of the spoken word, something that we've spoken about before. And indeed, Bilam, heathen prophet, had the power of the word for evil. But here, we're talking about the tremendous cosmic force of articulation. A person making a neder or a shavua, a vow or an oath, to change the very status of something, to declare something to be holy, or to take upon oneself the obligation to perform something. Here, this is the power of the spoken word that propels the individual to a new level of holiness. So this requires a high level of consciousness, of connection, of being aware. And for this parsha to begin with this whole section of the vows and the oaths, it's really perfect when we think about it. How we are poised now as a nation, preparing to enter into the land of Israel. It's so perfect because didn't Hashem himself make a vow? We find it in Exodus 33:1, we find it in Numbers 14:23, we find it in Deuteronomy 1:35, 10:11, and 31:23. And of course, I'm referring to the vow that God himself made to bring them into the land that he swore to their fathers. So how perfect is this? He makes a vow, and in the highest form of imitating godliness, which is actually the purpose of our lives, we're also able to change the very shape of reality by making a vow. But again, this whole concept of making a vow or an oath, it requires that. It requires consciousness, a connection. And this state of awareness, it's really the theme of the whole Torah. It's the theme of our lives. It's certainly the theme of going into the land, this connection, this consciousness, this awareness. And never to separate ourselves from that goal. Moshe was told that as soon as he concludes the business of the war that he is about to start, the vengeance that must be taken, he is going to be finishing his mission. And yet he did not hesitate or tarry at all. He immediately sought to fulfill God's commandment and to begin this operation that we read about in the beginning of this Torah portion because of that consciousness and that connection. And this idea, it's not just a state of mind, but it's also a state of being. It's a state of reality. And the opposite of this connection that would allow a person to change the very status of life, to make an oath, to make a vow, is a certain type of manufactured or a fabricated state of denial. And we're talking here about the very goal of our life experience. We're about to come into the land of Israel. We have a preface here to our new reality that emphasizes the power of the spoken word, for which a person must be able to employ a certain level of focus, of being focused. What is that? What are we talking about here? What is this goal of our lives? It's not about being religious, in quotation marks. The word religious is not at all descriptive of what our lives really are, which of course are living for Hashem. We're not about being religious, we're about being alive. We're about being conscious and connected and sensitive, to be sensitive to God and His world, to be sensitive to ourselves and to each other as being part of that world. It's a way of living, but it isn't an ism that could be described as being religious. When Israel enters into the land, and finally she is able to paint her masterpiece, everything is going to be different. The world will be different. That's the goal. It's this connection. And the ism was created when we went into exile, when we failed that mission. And now we have an opportunity again to enter into the land and to make sure that that connection is never severed. So if that's the goal, and these parshiot now are preparing us to enter into the land and to keep that focus and to keep that connection. And it's about a certain level of sensitivity, awareness, focus, consciousness, for lack of a better word. So what is the opposite of that? The unconsciousness that is such a plague to our lives, the disconnect. If you would, the secular viewpoints of viewing the world, viewing the land, viewing our lives in a very myopic, self-serving way, devoid of this God consciousness. Secular denotes an attitude or activities or other things that have no spiritual basis. Synonyms would be profane, temporal, worldly, mundane. In this week's Torah portion, we read about the request of Reuven and Gad to remain on the other side of the Jordan. This was born of a secular view of the land and their relationship with it. They said, this is a great land for livestock, and we've got plenty of livestock. So let us have this land. Don't bother bringing us across. Obviously, their priorities were all confused. They said, we'll build pens for our livestock, and afterwards they said, we'll also build cities to protect our children. And then we'll arm ourselves and we'll be in the vanguard until we have brought all of the children of Israel into their place. And Moshe responded, okay, if you do this, if you arm yourselves before Hashem, and every armed man shall cross the Jordan before Hashem, until He drives out His enemies from before Him, and the land shall be conquered before Hashem, then you shall return Hashem. Remember Him? Is that what you meant? Then you can do this. It's possible to be in Eretz Israel, but to have a godless attitude, and how much more so outside the land of Israel. The connection, the equation of our lives, of being in Hashem's world, doesn't work unless it's before Hashem. And now, in these final stages of preparation, this is our focus and our emphasis, not to lose that connection, not to fall into that worldview wherein we're only here for ourselves. Now, in Matot-Masei, in our second Torah portion, we review the stops and starts, all of the way stations, all of the journeys along the way to this point. And it's always from here to there, and from there to here. The next destination is always influenced by where we've been. And all these journeys that are mentioned, of course, many of them were added on as a result of the sin of the spies. So is this really the place for nostalgia? Yet we have this immense feeling of God recounting all of these way stations as a type of nostalgia. Rashi comments, what is the mood, the idea of the recounting of all of these places? It's like a king who was traveling with his son who was ill, and they were going for a special cure. They were traveling to a doctor, and then recounting those days, he says, "This is where we slept, remember? This is where you didn't feel so well, your head hurt you. This is where this happened to us, this is where that happened." It's like God himself now, in recounting all of these journeys, is feeling so moved by it, now that it's behind us. And now in chapter 34, we come to the borders of the Promised Land. And this theme of consciousness, of focus, of connection. Don't forget about me. Don't make the mistake of Reuven and Gad. Don't forget about this connection. And so as the book of Numbers draws to a close, and we've been through this tremendous adventure in dealing with who we are as people, and finally purging and cleansing in the most cosmic catharsis the issues that plagued the nation during these years. We're about to go into the land. Matot-Masei draws to a close with the mentioning of the ultimate connectors of this consciousness, the ultimate non-secularists, the ultimate example of the consciousness that we seek to come into the land. Once again, the daughters of Tzlaf-Chad. We read in chapter 27 last week, in verse 1, about the daughters of Tzlaf-Chad. The verse uses the expression, "they drew near." And this is not a simple thing. Their issue, their claim, was not about themselves. It was not only about their tribal portion. They, at a time of crisis for the nation, at a time when the men's hearts were weakened, they drew close. They drew the entire people close. They drew the entire people back to Hashem. They were truly heroines who saved the day because of this consciousness. After the debacle of the spies, we were told to wear tzitzit, that we should not stray, that we should not forget, that we keep this consciousness intact all the time. And the whole book of Dvarim that we're going to be reading, the exhortation of Moshe, is all about emphasizing over and over again, never forget what we saw, never lose the connection, so that we can enter into the land of Israel and truly paint the masterpiece that is the destiny of the Jewish people, to bring this connection of consciousness to the whole world.